The people are celebrating in Hungary. We have massive news to report. After 16 years of authoritarian power, the people of Hungary have ousted Viktor Orban and his Fidesz party. About 78% voter turnout in Hungary. Voter turnout setting essentially record highs there. Peter Magyar, who leads the opposition HUNGARY party, the pro-European Union party, the pro-democracy party, the anti-Putin and anti-MAGA party, will go on to win this election, and not just win this election, but win big. The projections are that the HUNGARY party will go on to win a supermajority. They need 133 seats to do that, to get that 2/3. They are on track to do that. Regardless, the HUNGARY party, the opposition party, now the majority party, will have a majority in the parliament. But if they can hit that 2/3, they can change the constitution of Hungary with that supermajority. So we're just waiting on that. But the projections are they will hit that supermajority, folks. The people in Hungary are rejoicing. You heard at the outset, Russia go home, Russia go home. You had Donald Trump and J.D. Vance and Putin and the Kremlin and the Trump regime working hard together to try to prop up Orban every single day, post after post from Donald Trump telling the people of Hungary, vote Viktor Orban. Donald Trump dispatched Marco Rubio to Hungary, J.D. Vance to Hungary. The MAGA movement held a CPAC convention in Hungary where Netanyahu's son was there. Netanyahu tried to prop up Viktor Orban. But folks, the opposition HUNGARY party will go on to win this election, and they will win it big with 53% reported, and this number will increase as well. Of course, the HUNGARY party up 52.8% to 39.1%. 133 seats needed for the supermajority. As I noted, they are on their way to get that, but we will be keeping you posted there. Viktor Orban has officially conceded. He called up Peter Magyar of the HUNGARY party and congratulated Peter Magyar of the HUNGARY party. Peter Magyar posted, Prime Minister Viktor Orban congratulated us on our victory over the phone. A new Prime Minister of Hungary, Peter Magyar, everybody. And, you know, while Orban is right of that Putin sycophantic ilk, just like Donald Trump, at least Orban got on the phone and congratulated Peter Magyar right away. And at least as of now, didn't say fake election and all the stuff that Donald Trump, the pathetic weasel in the White House, continues to whine about from 2020. But it is over, folks.
So imagine you are a small country. You're very proud, very important country, but you are little and you are not very rich. And you decide in your little country that it is time to put in streetlights. Right? You think we may not be a wealthy country, but gosh darn it, it is the 21st century, and in a bunch of our little towns and villages that want them, we're going to put in streetlights, or we're going to upgrade streetlights in places that need them to be fixed up. We're going to get funding, we'll get grants for streetlights, and we're going to do that all over the place in our country. Now, if you are a town that wants in on this project, if you want some streetlights for your town, what your government tells you is, okay, here's how you're going to do it. Your town, your village, if you want streetlights, what you have to do is you have to hire this particular company. And it's a consulting company, and that consulting company will assess your town's needs. And after they do an assessment in your town, they will basically attest to what kind of streetlights you need, and then those are the kind of streetlights you will get. That's the process. That's how we're getting streetlights in our country. And it turns out that as all the little towns all over the country start going through this process to get their streetlights, they all, as they are told to do, they all hire this one company, this one consulting firm to help them get their streetlights. And a couple of things pretty quickly emerge. First of all, that company the company they're all told they have to use in order to get their streetlights, that company turns out to be owned by a guy who's in business with the prime minister's son-in-law. And the business he's in with the prime minister's son-in-law, the company they own together, turns out to be a company that makes streetlights. Huh! What a coincidence, right? So every little town all over your country has to hire this one company. And every single time, the guy who runs that company comes in, looks around and says, yes, I've looked at this very carefully. I've assessed your unique needs here in your town. And it turns out the only streetlights you should get, the only streetlights you can get, the streetlights, in fact, that you're going to get are the streetlights that are only sold by the company that is owned by the prime minister's son-in-law and also me. That is your only choice. You want streetlights, that's how you get them. And even though these guys had no streetlight expertise, even though their company was brand new, essentially set up just for this purpose, even though basically nobody else had ever bought streetlights from them before without being forced to do so, now, all of a sudden, boy, do they have a lot of business. Yeah, the prime minister's son-in-law turns out to be basically the sole supplier of streetlights to towns and villages all over the country. And as such, he is paid very handsomely for that in public funds. The country where this happened happens to be in Europe. And it turns out the funding for the streetlights came from the European Union, from the EU. When investigative reporters figured out that this scheme was happening with the streetlights, and when the EU investigated themselves, they realized this well-intentioned project, sort of small-scale project to put streetlights in this poor country, had instead become basically just a project to make the prime minister's son-in-law a millionaire. The company, of course, says they did nothing wrong, but the EU pulled their funding for that project. How did the prime minister react to that? He said, well, okay, I guess we can't do this with EU funds anymore. We'll just pay for it ourselves, our country, out of our meager budget as one of the poorest countries in Europe. We'll pay for it. Which means the prime minister decided that he would just pay his son-in-law directly from government funds. And that is how Viktor Orban's son-in-law made his first millions. Since then, over the course of Viktor Orban's 16 years in power, Orban's son-in-law has become one of the wealthiest men in the whole country, worth hundreds of millions of dollars at least. One of the sectors he's in is streetlights. Another sector is that he owns lots of luxury hotels. I mentioned the EU, the European Union. The EU has a presidency that rotates from country to country every 6 months. When the EU presidency automatically rotated to Hungary, to Viktor Orban a couple years ago, what that meant in very practical terms is that there would be lots of official delegations from other European countries coming to Hungary all the time, coming to Budapest to do EU business because Viktor Orban was the president of the EU for that 6-month period. What some of those other countries would soon find was that no matter what hotels they booked themselves into in Budapest for one of these official visits, the Orban government would somehow find a way to unbook them from the hotels they wanted to stay at, and instead they would find themselves magically rebooked into one of the hotels owned by Viktor Orban's son-in-law. They would make reservations at different hotels, and the Orban government would unbook them and put them in his son-in-law's hotels. But ahead of the elections yesterday in Hungary, which saw that young man's father-in-law turfed out of power after 16 years and potentially now facing prosecution for corruption and theft of public assets. Ahead of yesterday's election in Hungary, Orban's son-in-law left the country. He left Hungary and reportedly relocated to the friendlier environs of the United States.
So the clip lay out a scenario that feels simple on the surface, but carry deeper implications once you think if it thought a small country trying to modernize its infrastructure sounds like a positive step, especially when public funding and external support are involved. But the moment a single private company become a mandatory gatekeeper for access to those funds, the situation began to shift. It raises a fundamental questions about whether development projects are being designed for public benefit or structured in a way that narrow opportunity from an analytical standpoint. This is when where governance and accountability become central to the discussion. The structure itself starts to matter more than the intentions behind it. If you look at it from another angle, some might argue that government often rely on designated partner to streamline project. Having a single consulting firm called in theory create consistency and efficiency across regions. However, that argument weakens when the same firm repeatedly direct outcomes toward a connected business interest. That issue is not just about process but about incentive. When decision making authority is concentrated in a way that benefits a small network, it becomes difficult to separate public service from private again. That tension is what makes the example in the clip worth examining more closely, right? Breaking it down in simple terms, the process described essentially remove competition toward or not choosing the best option available. They are following a predetermined path. This means pricing, quality, and innovations are no longer driven by open market condition